Again, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to give us a huge, long introduction, but you know, it's Sarah's like, where's Waldo? Everywhere you go. Sarah is in that picture, doing something. Did you ever see the Where's Waldo, the COVID edition? And it's just what Waldo. Sorry, that's a thing. Sarah has burst upon the scene in the history of science, and as I say, everywhere you go, you seem to have Sarah organizing something or putting on some kind of event or running electronics for that international thing that we did for 24 hours at the International Union. Our PhD is from the Institute for History, Philosophy, History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at U of T, and is now in a postdoc position at York. At York, and also working on a project funded by the Templeton Chain, and dissertation, which you should all hopefully will come out soon, on the 19th century Muslim polymath Sir Said Ahmed Khan. Take it away.
Thanks, Gordon. I'm just going to turn my timer on so I don't get carried away. But let's go. All right, everyone. Welcome. First of all, thank you so much to Megan, Gordon, and Melanie for all the hard work you've done behind the scenes. And I especially want to thank all the student volunteers who actually might be running around. So Shaylee, Morag, Henry, Milo, and Katie, thank you so much for your help, whether you hear it or not. We do appreciate the effort you're putting behind the scenes. That was more than said video. So really appreciate it. So I used 10 years in the table, but technically it's 9 years and a few months since. But it's okay, we can shave off a few months here and there for a little bit of time. So what I want to tell you about is the pivotal experience through the Cosmopolitan project. And then I'll give you a little bit of more information of another summer school that was heavily influential. And then we're going to do a not so elegant pivot to a research talk. So the first little bit will be a reflection, and the next little bit will be a bit from my forthcoming monograph. So first, my own intellectual and ethical commitments as a Canadian. You've all heard the land acknowledgements, but in my humble opinion, it doesn't go far enough. So I want to share some resources with you that if you're learning about first time about Canada's relationship with Indigenous communities, you can learn some more however you choose to do so. The first thing is, you've probably seen some of the signs around the college, something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. So I just want to tell you a little bit, and you can access the entire volumes, maybe somehow try and integrate it into your teaching, even if you're not covering Canada, just to talk about some of the experiences globally. You know, US to the South gets a lot of attention, so some of the Canadian stuff gets buried, but we're just trying to highlight what's happening there. So the commission was mandated to reveal to Canadians the complex truth about the history of the ongoing legacy of church-run residential schools in a manner that fully documents the individual and collective harms perpetrated against Aboriginal peoples and honor the resilience and courage of former students, their families, and communities. So I highly recommend taking a look at it when you have some time. If you're a map person, another resource I would highly recommend is called native-land.ca, and it just doesn't cover North America. You can also go over to other parts of the world, such as Australia, and you can look at the territories, the languages, and the treaties. It's a really amazing resource to kind of get a global sense of what is going on, and they're growing continuously. So if you really enjoy maps, this is something for you, and it's been a very valuable teaching resource in the classrooms. The third thing is coming from the University of Alberta, which is a free online course that you can sign up for. It's about Indigenous Canada. It's a 12-lesson course from the Faculty of Native Studies, and it explores the different histories and contemporary perspectives of Indigenous people living in Canada. There's a lot of resources. If you can't remember them, I'd be happy to share the link of resources with you at another time and have them on the list. But I do want to start with that sort of commitment to what we're doing here and how we can take active action to remember. So with that, speaking of memories, I'm a historian, so I have this in my files from 2015. This is the poster for the workshop that took place in 2015 in Manipal, India. So at that time, I was in between my master's and PhD, and I was a bit confused because I was working on a project that deals with South Asian studies, Islamic studies, and the history of science. And generally in our field, you go one-to-one. Either you do Islam, South Asia, or you do Islam history of science, or you do South Asian history of science. To try and write something that was more comprehensive and global back then was quite difficult. Now, of course, our field is in a wonderful direction, and I'm really happy with how things are going. But it was complicated. So I spoke to Isaac Heath, who was on the project, and he mentioned that there was a summer school taking place in India. I'm like, this sounds like exactly what I need to do. And so I took my Canadian passport, I looked up at the rules online, and I submitted it. And I said, okay, in 7 days I get a visitor's visa. But I get my passport back and saying it's been rejected because I did not follow the rules. Now, I've lived in Germany for 2 years, I like following rules. But it turns out, because I am born in Pakistan, it circumvents my ability as a Canadian citizen to apply for a visa to India. So I had to go to the Indian embassy. So I'm from near a city called Mississauga, which is adjacent to Toronto. So I had to go to the Indian embassy and ask them what's going on. And they gave me two options. They said, show proof you renounced Pakistani citizenship or get it on a Pakistani passport. I have no Pakistani passport and have no Pakistani citizenship. So I'm stuck in a bureaucratic loophole. So what do? Well, I go complain to my mother, and she calls up one of her friends who's a diplomat, and he says, you know, this is a normal thing. You have to go to the Pakistani consulate and get an affidavit from them. So I then drive over to the Pakistani consulate, get the affidavit that says I have no Pakistani documents, and then I take that to the Indian embassy, and still they say, no, we can't give you a visa. Why? Because they have to make sure the workshop exists in India. And they needed Parvit, who was the organizer, to go to a police station and sign an affidavit that says he was responsible for my actions while I'm in India. So it was a lot. It was suddenly my entire childhood, you know, I was 7 when we left Pakistan. My entire adulthood has been North America. And suddenly I felt very Pakistani in dealing with the Indian embassy. The irony is strong there. But what ended up happening is the day before my flight, an hour before the embassy closed, they gave me my visa. I have never seen my mother drive so fast. And I finally made it onto that flight to attend this incredible workshop in Manipal. So I have a few images from the workshop and some of the places on the slide, but I want to reflect on the experience because it was pretty eye-opening to me. The first thing was, I met Gordon, I met David Cantaloni, and it was a few people that I had read on paper, but never met in person. And it was a quite interesting setting because it made me realize I am the global norm. And while I may look a certain way, my pedagogy and my upbringing brought certain assumptions to the table. I was able to engage critically with students in India and other parts of the world students. And it was quite rare for them to also interact with someone who was Pakistani origin because of the politics. So you can just imagine the weight of this workshop and, early 20s me being like, wow, the world is terrible. But we can do so much to make it better. And it was amazing. We visited a beautiful Hindu temple, and right next to it was a mosque with the azan praying going on. We visited a Jain temple as well. And you can see the sort of coexistence at the local level that you don't see at the government levels. Again, for me, it was quite an interesting experience. This is supposed to be the land of my ancestors, but it feels foreign. And the reasons for that, again, have to do with colonialism and, we don't have enough time to go into unpack that. But what I also want to emphasize is the actual students over there. Of many of them, they have been against the government and have suffered. One of them even sought asylum, and some people on this project have helped them to do that. So it's not just a matter of let's try and integrate people, but it's also looking at where their lives were and what we can do to advocate towards them. I may have had this tiny visa problem, but I have one of the top 20 passports in the world. I went from 192, which is a Pakistani passport, to the Canadian one. We still have to advocate for those spaces and make them accessible. So well before COVID, we were doing a lot of this digital work and trying to collaborate with greater communities. And one thing I realized, while the India experience was quite pivotal, it was also important for me to go into Islamic spaces and understand how the work is being done, so I can also reflect on my own. So if this was 2015, in 2018, I ended up in living in Granada, Spain for a month for this workshop called Critical Muslim Studies. And it was organized by people across the MENA region, which is Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. And there again, I felt that sense of discomfort where you're introduced to a pedagogy and ways of doing that you're unfamiliar with. And when you're sitting in the room, you look outside and see the Alhambra. And that itself is a layered history. So on one side of the slide is the view you get from the summer palace of the Alhambra. And on the other side is a statue of Christopher Columbus, right? So 1492 means something very different in Granada, because it's also when the Jews and Muslims were expelled from the city. And we have, again, a story that was told in North America. We're very critical of Columbus, but in Granada, it was told that they have a pro-Columbus rally and the anti-Columbus rally. And they come to this statue and they argue with each other. I was like, this is really interesting because it's the other side of the Atlantic. So you have, again, this like layered history. And again, the history of Al-Andalus in Spain, it was fascinating. Just being there and situating yourself just makes you realize how important it is to do this work in a way that you enjoy and is also ethical. And it's tough, but it's fun, I promise. So with that, I want to quickly pivot now, and as eloquently as I can, to talking a bit about the history of science. So what all that led to was realizing that the thesis could not be simply looking at a certain area of the discipline, but rewriting the discipline in a sense that these four that I picked up for no particular reason can talk to each other. So the first one is Victorian Popularizing of Science by PhD advisor Bernard Lightman. The second one is Reading Darwin in Arabic by Marwa al-Shakri. That book's actually where I found my PhD project in one line. So I'll expand on that later. The third is Koji Mukherjee's works. I'm just using Koji to represent the big area of South Asian scholarship in our field. And then of course, knowledge in transit. I know it's hard to read, but it's there. And why it was so important to start thinking, how does knowledge circulate? What does it mean? And how do we approach these in a way that when you have 5 languages at play, it's ethical? So in the research I'm doing, we deal with many times Arabic, Persian, Urdu, English, Hindi, now German as well, French, and you can't do it alone. So you have to be able to collaborate. And what you found in the discipline is people aren't really happy when you're telling them you want to be an edited volume. So I was like, I don't care. This sounds like fun. So we started working and collaborating in bigger spaces, going through sources of people who are experts in the languages, and also seeking out elders. There's certain 19th century words that don't exist in the dictionaries or online. So you can go to some of the elders. For example, my grandma, when I was really early on in my degree, she helped me quite a bit when I was getting the feel of what translations were through the language. When it came to Persian, my mom found me, Salim, who's an expert in Persian. And so when I was trying to go through the sources, I was able to make sure I was reading them properly. And the best story of translating with my grandma is we were going through a document, and a lot of these publications in Urdu have a foreword that tells you who the patron is. And so she looks at me and she's like, I don't understand the words, Sarah, maybe you can help me. I'm like, Grandma, okay. She's like, Jemis. And I'm like, Jemis? Oh, you mean James? And I remember this moment where you can find some of these words within the Urdu language and have this moment in reverse. Rather than when we see our names being misspelled and have 10 different spellings, what it looks like having James in that regard. So translation has been a place of joy for me because it allowed me to reclaim language in a way that North America slowly started to take away from it. And so it was really fun studying and getting to know more and more, but also collaborating with other scholars who speak different languages and seeing how the sources can be put together. And that's how you slowly start to get a more and more global survey in the discipline. That being said, I will now, talk about the source I had alluded to. So if we go back to Marwa al-Shakri's text, Reading Darwin in Arabic. So in the text, Marwa al-Shakri writes about this figure called Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, and at the time that he was exiled in India, he wrote a source that was condemning the Nijari, or the naturalists. And his target was actually this figure called Sayyid Ahmad. And literally, it's 2 sentences in her book. But I grew up hearing the name Sayyid Ahmad because he's considered as one of the founders of the original idea for there to be a nation for Muslims in South Asia. So why is he here? And then when you start looking up things, you realize that there's no answer to that. There's no explanation because no one's done a full survey of him. So this massive intellectual giant in South Asia is completely missing from our field. So initially, I started looking at the history of evolutionary biology. I thought I could write a piece about how I was thinking through Darwin's publications. I wanted to write something similar to what Marwa had done in the South Asian context. And so I did find the source, an article he wrote in 1896. It's the one on the slides. It's called Ala Halat for Insan Therapy, the stages of human development from an inferior to superior state. And the entire article shows how humans have come from an earlier animal form, and the ideology is compatible with Islam. And for me, there was nothing like this. It even challenged my own assumptions of Muslim evolution in the 19th century. What is happening is he does mention Darwin in this article, but he says it's the specifically the problem of the missing links. What he says is we talk about Mr. Darwin, and there's a problem of the missing links. But we will find them and they will prove the similarities among kinds. So for him, the problem of the missing links isn't. And so they are not as enthralled by origin of species because there's a context here. And again, this is not representative of like everybody's perspective. It's a very specific view. But there is a Muslim India in the 19th century thinking about human evolution from an earlier animal kingdom. And what this led to is an article that looks at what a previous thought was, and how it's tied again into Persian and Arabic notions of the world soul and the religious soul. And so it was trying to trace back all of these ideas. And again, how do these ideas come to South Asia, not just in the Middle East? So that became a little complicated because what you're doing is you're assuming that there is a Western notion of evolution. And back 10 years ago, it was very hard to write this sort of literature. Now it's gotten a lot better, especially when Wace's work has come out and many other things I can mention. But I realized I just had to do a dissertation where you write Sayyid Khan into the discipline, and you show how easily this figure fits into the field and ask, why has he been absent for so long? And so I will now take you through some of the really cool things that we do. So for those of you who may have never heard of him, this is Sayyid Khan. There's this joke that, one of the reasons he grew a beard was because it fit his Adam's apple, so it was aesthetic. But after a journey that I'll talk about, he also started wearing a Turkish vest, like the cat. And it was a very deliberate aesthetic choice to look a certain way after a certain period of time. So we'll go with that. But he is a polymath, and he is an extremely controversial figure. I have met people, one of my tweets on Twitter, I call it Twitter, that went viral and had to lock my account was something about him that the Hindu right found. And I had to go like, I'm gonna delete this and forget this ever happened. And so because he has this idea that India was a nation of two religions, one is Hindu, one is Muslim. Let's forget about the Sikhs. Don't forget about the Sikhs, that's a whole other thing. He was basically quite divisive for that. But for Muslims, he was quite imperative because he was making a case to say that there is a place here under British rule. And he was pro-empire. So how does this eclectic figure that I cannot do justice in this talk sort of fit into the modes we have, whether it's local, global? So it's really looking at the works we have on circulation of knowledge and what did he as the center? So how do we begin to write about it? And so that's what the book is slowly going to do, is show how easily, whether it's archaeology, whether it's science and religion, whether it's various other institution buildings, the 19th century stuff fits quite easily, and it is history of science. The biggest thing I think I can contribute is in 1864, he founded what is called the Scientific Society, which at its peak had over 500 members, the majority of which were locals. And the patron was the Duke of Argyll. So it's this mismatch of you have this institution that is now centered with a Muslim founding it, which at the time is quite new and a novel idea to let somebody local have control, as opposed to, the Royal Asiatic Society did not have local members for like the first 40 years or so. So creating the space at its time was quite novel. And so in 1869, he spent 17 months in England. So I'm going to spend a lot of time because I want to provincialize England in this talk. We will get there. And then he launches a journal and a periodical, Tehzib al-Akhlaq and the Eligar Institute Gazette. What he is most famous for is founding Oliver Muslim University. It's why I think a lot of his earlier work was not really discussed, because it's 1875 that he really becomes quite well known, quite controversial. And so what I'm trying to show, not just to historians of science, but to scholars of South Asia and scholars of Islamic studies, how important this thought about science is to his political, social, and religious agendas. So it's quite intermingled. And again, it took 6 years of my life, and it's still going, to sort of write this narrative about this really fascinating figure who I grew up hearing about, but now have a better understanding in a way of what he does. So let's dig a little more. Okay. So one of the coolest sources, it's called the Mohammedan Commentary on the Holy Bible. I can't talk about all those publications. I'm just going to highlight some of the ones that I think set a really good example of what we're doing. So one of my subfields is the field of science and religion. And one of my things is, how do you deal with a pluralistic religions and science? And so this has been one of the primary sources we've used to show what that could look like in adding the dimension of imperialism to the discipline as well. And so what you have is this 3-volume text published between 1862 and 1864, and it's written in the Urdu language with English side by side. So anytime anybody asks me, why are you using these words? I'm like, here's my, word bank. It's the easiest way to show your translation process. It's because they did it in the time. And it's from the author themselves hiring. He worked with a Jewish scholar. The ability to show what equivalents were in the 19th century. So for example, astronomy would be closer to ilm najum, which is knowledge of the stars, closer to the Arabic Persian sense, but something like geology is transliterated as geology because they see it as a new science. So this 400-page document, it's something still many scholars are working through, has all of these rich resources in it. It has so many interesting nuggets. One of the papers that I'm working on is how Sayyidina Khan uses a conversation with Bishop John Colenso from Natal, who cites the work of Charles Lyell. So you see this very global picture of Natal, which is around modern South Africa, British India, and also England. And this one piece of literature becomes quite circulating. So that's a separate paper as well on Colenso and Sayyidina Khan, and also this amazing letter that the X Club wrote. It's on the Darwin Correspondence Project, just absolutely eviscerated John Colenso, calling him, a charlatan. So it's things like this that become really interesting because it shows you how global it is. It's not just England to India. It's also what's happening in various parts of the trades, but also what's happening in the Islamic world. They're all coming through this time period, and it becomes more and more complicated. So this source is incredible. It's available online if anybody is interested in seeing it. And if you're interested in learning more, we can talk about it at lunch or something. But it's one of the things that really brings joy in why are we doing what we're doing and how we find to build the Urdu language into the discipline in a really cool way. So, oops, that's a laptop, not my, just going back to my notes. Give me 1 second. All right, lost it. Okay, perfect. But while he was working on the Bible commentary, so remember the first edition comes out in 1862, he's founding what is called the Scientific Society. And what you have on the screen is the first page of the Bible. It's founded in the city of Ghazipur in 1864, but within a year it moves to the city of Aligarh. And so what I'm trying to show is that this network that's based on translating and teaching science is one of the reasons Muhammad Anglo-Oriental College, which is now Aligarh Muslim University, happens to be in Aligarh. So it's really re-examining how important these networks work. And again, this is collaborative. So it's Sayyidina Khan and a few British officers like George Graham who are working together to institutionalize this. So you can follow all the government documents and petitions to try and put this group together and how people are being recruited. You can follow the money. You can see who's giving them money, who the translators are, who they're writing to. So all of their correspondence is available to be able to recreate what the society is doing. And again, there was only maybe a footnote in Provincializing Europe and maybe a few other references to it 10 years ago. And yeah, it's there. And so Yeah, so now on the field with the screen is you have a picture of the bylaws and a picture of the Gazette, which is formed in its first year. So the institution is called the Scientific Society. And to translate into such languages as may be in common among the people, those who work on arts and sciences, which being in English or any other European language are not intelligible to the natives. And he goes on, to search for and publish rare and oriental works, no religious work will come under notice of the society. So I have a longer argument on how the SDUK is quite influential to the formation of this group. There are various members of it that are in Delhi and are influencing it. The Asiatic Society influences it as well. But the reason they chose the English language is quite simple. They said the British are in power, it's the easiest one for us to work with. So there was an address given at another society in Bengal that was pretty much why you should go with English and not French or German. It was just pragmatic and easier. So in the first year, the society actually does quite well. They translate over 600 pages. They, again, have 300 members just in the first year, and they actually get land from the government to start a school and start giving public lectures. So again, it's slowly building an institution. And this is way before we even get to the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College. And so what the work does is it introduces you to this society and then also takes you on another journey. So just to situate ourselves, we're going to now start with Syed Ahmad Khan's travelogue for when he goes to England. So this is where Aligarh is, the starting point, the red dot. And this is a beautiful university that I have not been able to visit in COVID, and now, issues getting visas for government. So one day I'll make it, but if not, I'm really grateful to the librarians and archivists who have helped finding resources from many awkward places. So we start ourselves in Aligarh. This is the travelogue that Syed Ahmad Khan had. So it's in January of 1869. Syed Ahmad Khan moves to the city of Benares, and his son was awarded scholarship to study at Cambridge. So Syed Ahmad Khan wanted to go with him. So he wrote to William Mayor, who's a lieutenant governor of the Northwest Provinces, that he wants to go. And he and lessons to be applied for the good of India. So he is, in this context, when we're trying to contextualize, is just trying to get his visa, something I can relate to, or the permission to travel in that. But as I show, his reasons for the trip are way more complicated because the same William Lear he's writing to wrote a work called The Life of Muhammad, which was a biography of the Prophet Muhammad that Syed Ahmad Khan was found quite problematic. So he wanted to go and access the same archives in the UK and write sort of a response. But that comes out later, and that's the evidence for that. But he's not going to write that in letters to the commission for that. So what ends up happening is in 1870, he does publish something called the Essays of the Life of Muhammad. And that was while he was on this trip. So it's, while they start on April 1st, they arrive in May 4th to Dover. So it's a very long month trip, something we can do now in 7 hours. So it gave me a time to pause and appreciate scales of time and how long this journey took and the events that would happen day to day. I can't give you all of, there's some really cool little stories from the journey that they took, but I'll just give you a short little summary on the Rhodes voyage, where they went to Aden, Suez, Alexandria, Marseille, Paris, and Dover. So quite a few different cities were there, and it was quite an influential journey for Syed Ahmad Khan. But first things first, what's really interesting is how he discusses the railways. We've had a big critique of the railways and how they were built to extract capital. There's lots of studies of famine as well being caused because of how they're built. But in his travelogue, you can see how impressed they are that the trains and how they're running and what the system is like. And again, we're contextualizing the larger historical story, but also looking at the local account on what this travel journey looks like. So you have this really good account in the text about the railways and moving out towards sea. And so there's different layers here and there. There's also many discussions about historical sites that they saw. I'm just going to focus on one particularly. It's called the Cisterns of Dawila. And so they saw basically so this is, I'm quoting from the travelogue, 9 to 10 water tanks that collected rainwater and were arranged according to their size. The largest water tank is at the top, and the others slightly smaller, so the water filled the first tank and trickled down to others. Some locals claim that this was constructed by some Arab king of the pre-Islamic period, while others suspected it was King Shaddad, the lost city of Iran of the pillars that was referenced in the Quran. So you can see him trying to theorize where these cisterns came from. Details about the original construction are lost to time, but the tanks were actually restored by a lieutenant by the name of Lambert Playfair, who was the assistant resident at the time. So you can see again the sort of layered heritage and history and the restoration and sort of relationship that they have. And what ends up happening is Said Khan also meets a lot of locals who speak Urdu and English and various other languages in the markets. And he's completely fascinated by their relationships. He also meets some people who are from the Ottoman Empire, but they can read scientific texts. And he's so interested in how they're able to read these texts, and in India, they're not able to. So he becomes obsessed with this idea of translating knowledge, and also not only looking at what the British had done, but also what Turkish-speaking individuals were doing at the time. The other really one, and when I did this in my class, my students really enjoyed it because it was 2001, it was the Suez Canal. So as we know, in 2021, the Evergreen got stuck in the canal, and that's when a lot of people learned what happens when the Suez Canal is blocked. Go around. So, luckily in this travelogue, they did not go around. They went to Yemen and then traveled to Egypt via train. But the Suez Canal was not yet operational. It was 8 days away from opening. And so instead of taking the long journey around, they just arrived in the port and then traveled a bit longer on land. So it was Ferdinand Lesseps who was the instrumental engineer behind the construction. It was Sayyid Khan met him. So in the travelogue, you have this entire account of two men who don't speak the same language talk to each other, how they're sitting together in silence and doing their work. And so he was so impressed by what was going on and really wanted to have this conversation. And he writes at length about what an interesting interaction it was, especially after he met some Europeans who were not so optimistic about Indians and looking down upon them. So there was a really interesting correlation between French imperialism here as well from his travelogues. And it's really interesting. So what happens after this is they land in Paris and they end up going to Versailles. And in Versailles at the time, there were some paintings that have now been taken down because they're horrific. There were some of Algiers that were, he writes in his travelogues, they were quite horrific and scarring to see the display of brutality that the French displayed. And he had this vision that colonialism is good. And this was one of the first times he encounters the brutality and through art. And so that painting is not available for anybody to see anymore. So all we have is accounts of how it was described. He was really upset by how women were depicted without their clothing in a state of distress. Men were being just depicted in a very false manner. And he was so upset that this is what the great Western civilizations were doing. And you can sort of see a pivotal moment is by this painting. And he spends a lot of time in the travelogues talking about this. And yeah, it was quite interesting to experience. And so then we finally get to England. So they left on the 1st of April. They arrived on the 4th of May, 1869. There was he writes a lot how he does not have funding, something I think many of us can relate to. But he accomplished a lot during his stay. He was actually present for the last public readings of Charles Dickens. And he writes about that experience and what it was like to be in the crowd. He was also made an honorary member of the Athenaeum Club. And it was also renewed once. Again, quite an important feat for a Muslim from India in that time period. He was invited as honorary guest at the Society for Civil Engineers. And, he went to met many prominent figures, such as Lord John Lawrence, Thomas Carlyle, and numerous others. And he actually met George Campbell, the 8th Duke of Argyll, who was already the patron of the Scientific Society. And it was in London that he is knighted. So he has the title, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. I use Syed Ahmed to sort of go away from the colonial paradox, but people often ask me, why was he knighted? Well, this takes us back to the rebellions, revolutions, revolts, however we choose to describe what happens in India in 57. So he ends up actually saving the lives of various British officers during this time period. Because again, he was working for the local government and was friends. So he just hid them in a house. And he also suffered quite a bit. His mother passed away afterwards. There was a lot of loss during the rebellions. And he ends up writing about this. And that's when he has a distinct idea of what it means. Because Muslims were also blamed for the rebellions along with various other parties. Very complicated, I can't do justice in this talk. But it's to show that he learned how to work the system and was able to then have these experiences in England, get knighted, and then continue to use that to then go back to India. So, yes, and so he met the Duke of Argyll, he was in all these spaces. And so then he goes back to India after this experience. So again, he founds a scientific society, he goes back to, he has this voyage from India to London, and then he goes back and he decides that the scientific society isn't enough. He wants to try and form an actual educational institution. And so what he does is he launches a prize. And he puts a committee together that's called the Select Committee for the Diffusion of Advancement of Learning among Mohammedans of India. And what this report is, it's 20 essays that were submitted to the competition. This is an article in the future I will write because you have access to all of the essays that people wrote and what their arguments were. And it ends up being the claim that they make on why there should be a separate college for Muslims in North India. It's a fantastic primary source as well. I'm just going to show you one page from it as we go. I'm going to give you all one of these today, but that's fine. But this is really cool. And so the heading reads, why the study of modern sciences was not introduced among the Mohammedans. So here we have a definition of modern science at the local level for this group of actors. And I think it's just so cool to sort of decompress it. So I've given the highlights that separates the three types. So again, I am teased that geology was transliterated as geology in Urdu. So they treat it as a modern science. That did not exist among old Greeks and Mohammedans. And so they treat geology as a new science. And then there's a second class which existed, but the principles on which they were founded have been proven to be wrong and new principles have been established. And the example was astronomy and chemistry. And then the third kind was sciences which existed, but no fundamental difference has occurred, just improvements have been made. So this is mechanics, mathematics, arithmetics. So here we have this entire document, it's about 200 pages, that talks about this very thing that we want to discuss. What happens after the fall of Baghdad? Where is the sources that went east after 1258 with the rise of the Safavid, Mughal, and Ottoman empires? It's a big gap in our discipline. And what's really interesting is how these actors in the 19th century are thinking about certain issues as well. And it's a really rich document that goes back and forth. And so I highly recommend anybody who is interested to go through it because it really, really does provide a insight. It's Islam, it's South Asia, and it's history of science, which is a really cool intersection that we definitely need to work more on. Okay, so what I want to do as I wrap up is just slowly show you some of the other really cool primary sources. One of them was an earlier one about machines and mechanics. And so this is Sayyid Khan's earlier publications, and he needed a patron for them to be published. And so the original sources were often Arabic and Persian, and they wanted to translate them into the Urdu language so it's more accessible. So what ends up happening is, and I again have had time to sort of talk about language and power, but Persian was a language of the Mughal courts. When the British took over, they removed it and made it English, but then Urdu language retained the sort of power in the courts. But there are many other regional languages like Punjabi, Hindi comes later on. So I don't want to take away from the regional languages, but Urdu does become this sort of elite courtly language because of this shift of power from Persian to English. So that's why I think that if I write in Urdu, it's going to be accessible to more people. So that's a really cool source with many different descriptions and diagrams. This is another source of a mathematical instrument that his grandfather used to own. So his grandfather was a diplomat for one of the Mughal emperors and also a student of Hafez Hussain Khan. And so you have another layer of the history in this context. And then you have this fascinating article called Mateen Dar Tale Harkat Zameen, firm assertion with regards to false motion of the earth. So it's an 1848 text he writes that says the earth does not move. And it's a really interesting example because a decade later, he changes his mind. So he publishes, the later version of himself, explaining why he thought that and what the problems might be. So Qidwai is written in a richer Urdu that was where I use my grammar a lot because it's a more Persianized version. And some of the context is so fascinating in this text. So this is another translation that's been done. Oh yeah, if anybody's interested, a lot of these I've translated in English, so I'm happy to share them as resources. The other text he does is he has this map of the Americas. And so this is quite fascinating as well, because again, you get a perspective of what it looks like. There's a much richer story to this document, a historical rewrite and a correction of the vizier of one of the Mughal emperors. And again, just some fascinating diagrams and accounts of this. This is in Persian, and this is why I needed Salim Uncle to help, because I was trying to get a sense of what is happening, and you need quite a bit of experts to go through this. And so what I hope you're also seeing is between how the script is written here and the script is written in the other texts, how it slowly starts to become easier to read and standardize. So there's a whole other chapter I have that I didn't do on the lithographic printing and how the freedom of the press also influences this and how you don't need a patron anymore to print, but that's for another topic in the future. And then you have various other documents as well. So there's this archaeological survey he does called Asar and Sanadid, which has two versions as well. One is written in a very classical manner, and the other is written for British officials to buy, and it's basically a survey of the monuments of Delhi. And because it comes before the rebellions, it's one of the really important archaeological surveys of the period, where he actually had servants go and dig up and take prints of the monuments, which a lot of them did get destroyed later on. So he ends up being heavily cited in the archaeological survey of Delhi, but then his name gets removed in several places. So you can sort of also see erasure slowly happening through government documents. I could talk about these sources for hours. I'll try and, yeah, you saw the bylaws, you saw the commentary. This is from his travelogue, actually, where he was explaining some of the distances that they were going, the degrees. So while he's on the journey as well, you can see some calculations taking place with scientific instruments. And then you've got Al-Mahamat there. And so you can see all of these sources, whether it's history of the math, whether it's science and religion, whether it's institutions, it's history of evolutionary biology, it's scientific manuscripts, these sort of all come together with this one massive intellectual from South Asia. And what I want to sort of reflect on is how this came to be. Working on this was extremely difficult and still is, because it takes in so many different forms of knowledge. What we have is a really good support system from some senior scholars who want to see this kind of work happen. So I've been very grateful to people, my PhD advisor, Bernie, Gordon, Jim, all who were like, this is crazy, go for it. And I've really appreciated also like junior scholars and my peers who've read my work and have been very, very generous with their feedback. And that's what we want to see. We heard Elder Albert Marshall yesterday talking about community. And that's the kind of thing we should be aiming for, rather than, fighting with each other and competing, is how do you collectively build? And it also comes from those of you who do have power, right? Change how you look at things, how you look at merit. And I think that's how slow change will come, and that's reflecting on this journey. There's so many people who've been lost to just time in the discipline due to a lack of resources. And I think we all need to really think about what we can do with the small amount of agency we have to help them. For me, it's been advocating for visas, advocating for online spaces. And that's why I'm so glad to Melanie and Megan for pulling off such a wonderful hybrid conference with all you lovely people who are online. But I will leave it there because I know you're on your way to lunch. Thank you so much.
Well, the priority of the other speakers, maybe one question or two, and then we can get to lunch. Is there anything pressing? Katie,
Sorry, do you have a sort of
yes.
question that
There's two questions going on. Hold on. Mic is on. You have a question up here. Hot in the hole at the break. Yes, Katie, go ahead, fire away.
Earlier people were talking about the neighborhood scale, and I'm struck by how you can do this work that you're doing, Sarah, because you're doing biology, which is this immensely conventional way of doing history of science and fact. So can I ask you to reflect on biology and whether, what would you do without that? How do you give shape to the currents you're talking about, without that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I think it really depends on what we're looking at. It's a question of, I think, institutions. So, for example, if I wasn't looking at, say, that with Khan, I would want to focus, sorry. On the scientific society itself, but to get to that, I need to start with him. So I think we still need like the traditional archival material looking for sources. If I wanted to start with that, I would have never found it. But it's because I think I focused on his biography and his life, that's how we got to it. But that wasn't how I started. I started looking at what is the reception of evolution in South Asia, of Darwin in South Asia. And that's when I realized I can't do this ethically. And so the biography was a way to, so a lot of the work is a historiographical analysis. And then I'm hoping as people look at this and say, you're working on an elite actor, we need more like, working class voices, we need people who speak various other regional languages, but so the work is there and then we can move forward. But a similar shift happened in discipline as well. So you start with looking at elite actors, then you start looking at popular voices, and then you start moving to other voices through this, I'm very lucky I just happen to be bilingual. So that's what made it so easy to read these sources and say, why doesn't this fit? And so I think it's understanding that not everybody will come to the table with the same skill set. Knowing how to publish a journal, but having that skill set is something you can't just give someone quickly. So anyway, I have very, very deep thoughts of where we need to go with it. I hope that helps. We can talk more at lunch.
Okay, Stefan, very quick.
Yes, quick question. I think in the beginning you said that he was very well known at his time. Actually, sort of globally prominent. So I wonder when the forgetting happens. I think there's already biography in English and an additional works in the 19th century. So when does the forgetting happen? When does it?
Yeah, you're asking a wonderful question. It's something Bernie and I are working on. I'm looking at the biggest example I can give you is T.H. Huxley and Julian Huxley and how their view of the East changes in their publications. So T.H. Huxley would still mention things about the East and be appreciative, whereas Julian completely dismisses it. So I think there's this shift that happens when we're trying to taste where exactly there's geopolitical issues for how the East is presented. We can talk more about it at lunch, but it's a much more complicated process. And that's why I'm really enjoying some of the German sources that I've been working on lately, because the origins of Islamic studies comes from a German Jewish heritage, Ignatius Goldfuss. And so I've been looking at some of these resources. And so it's a complicated narrative that we're now trying to look at what exactly happens. But it is getting better. As I said, it's a reflection of 10 years. Now there's so many more interesting and better voices. Like I wouldn't do the same project again if I started a PhD today, but it's a catch-20.
Excellent, thank you. Enjoy lunch. Thank you very much, sir.